everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be doing my September wrap-up. This is a little bit later than I was hoping it was going to be, but the last couple of weeks have just been really busy. So trying to find time to film and do all that stuff has been a little bit difficult. Even now, as if you've been on the channel for a little while and you recognize this setup, this is my room. So sometimes when I don't have the house to myself, I will come up and record in my bedroom because it means my kids are home, and this is me trying to find the best quiet pocket of the house that I can. So they are home today, and I am trying to get this video up so that I can get back on a regular recording and posting schedule. But I'm really excited to talk about my September wrap-up because for me, September was an amazing reading month. It was really hard to pick a favorite book of the month because I read so many fantastic books, and I feel like I got to read a lot of variety this past month. So for the majority of the year, most of my books every month have been made up of adult fantasy. Part of starting the BookTube channel was to get back into adult fantasy, and I have been having the best time catching up on all of that backlogged adult fantasy that I had been missing out on when I was reading more widely in other genres. But in September, I read pretty diversely, and I have to say that it was a really great experience. I really enjoyed everything that I was reading, and I don't know if that's because I was kind of bouncing from genre to genre or if it was just because the books were phenomenal in and of themselves. But I'm excited to talk to you about the books that I have read, and I've decided to categorize them by genre so that I can timestamp it for you. So if there is a particular group of books that you're not that interested in, you'll be able to just fly through them. In total, I read 11 books in September, and I have had one book that is ongoing, and it might be a little bit disappointing because I think people wanted to know my thoughts on this book, but unfortunately I still haven't finished it, but I will touch on that at the very end of the video. I decided to start off with my sci-fi reads for September because the very first book that I read this month was science fiction, and so I thought that it would take top billing in the video as well. So I read 2 works of sci-fi this month, and the very first one is Dune. So Dune has been on my TBR forever. I have talked at great length about Dune, so I'm not going to talk that much about it now. All I will say is that it was a 5-star read for me. It has become one of my favorite standalone novels of all time. It was fantastic, much less intimidating than I was expecting. But if you would like any other thoughts, you can check out my spoiler-free review. You could check out the conversation on Joanna's channel that I did with Joanna and Mike and Philip, or you can check out the group live chat that we had on Joanna Souza's channel. So they were all really fun to take part in. They were all really fun to record, and I encourage you to go there if you are looking for more thoughts about Dune. The other work of sci-fi that I read this month is really more of it's a dystopian novel, and it's also one that has been on my TBR for a really long time, and that is Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower. So this is the very first time I have read anything by Octavia E. Butler, which is a travesty, but some authors just get pushed down the TBR, but I am very excited that I have finally read something by her. Before I read Parable of the Sower, I actually didn't know that it is a duology, but I have now discovered that this is a dystopian duology by Octavia E. Butler that touches on the perils of humanity post an environmentally mediated apocalypse, essentially. So there has been a lot of environmental changes. The landscape of the earth has changed a lot, and we follow one young woman as she tries to navigate her hopes and expectations for the future. And it's a really fascinating book, but be warned, if you are going to go into it, it is a lot darker than I was expecting. I really enjoyed it. I gave this one 4 stars, and I really liked my reading experience, but I felt like I had to take the book really slowly because it was very bleak. I was not expecting it to be as heavy as it was, which it's a dystopian novel. Of course it's going to be heavy, but I think some things that are especially hard for me to read about were in this book. So there is a lot of not in any graphic way, but told in a very vague and kind of matter-of-fact way. There's a lot of sexual violence toward children, and I find that really difficult. It kind of makes my thoughts spiral a little bit. Is the one thing that I cannot compartmentalize when I'm reading. It automatically makes me think of my own kids and all the what ifs that could possibly happen. So that was a little bit of a heavier read for me, but I can definitely appreciate why Octavia E. Butler is such a pillar of the fantasy community. What a brilliant mind, a lot of really profound ideas that were explored in this book. And if you like dystopian fiction, then by all means, you should pick up Parable of the Sower. The book itself is very accessible and very easy to read. It was just my own difficulties that kept me from reading it quickly. But I am very glad that I read it, and I am looking forward to reading the second part of the duology, which I'm thinking I will probably pick up sometime in the new year. From science fiction, I guess it's easy to transition into fantasy. So I read 2 works of adult fantasy this month. One was a very old book and one was a reread. So the very old book that I read was Lud in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees. So this is a book that I talked about in one of my more recent videos, which was The Last 100 Years of Fantasy. And this was one of the fantasy books that I talked about from the 1920s. So this was written by Hope Mirrlees in the 1920s and then re-released in the 1970s, where it became a work of fantasy that went on to inspire some of the biggest names in fantasy today. Most notably, I would think, is Neil Gaiman. He talks at great length about his love for this book, how he believes it is one of the greatest works of fantasy ever written. And that was really why I wanted to pick it up, because it had been such a big inspiration for one of my favorite authors. I will say that I did enjoy Lud in the Mist. I thought that it was really fascinating. It's very atmospheric, which is something that I think about Neil Gaiman's writing as well. The story transplants you into the setting from the very beginning. You are part of this world. You can feel the tension. You can experience the emotions of the characters alongside them. You know what it feels like to be part of their town and part of their environment. And that's what, when I talk about atmospheric reads, that's what it means for me. It means that these books can easily transport you into their setting through the use of language and description and character interactions. This had a very creepy kind of mystery vibe. The basic setup is that you have the town of Lud in the Mist, which borders on to fairyland. But fairy is something that is very taboo amongst the people who live in this town. And there starts to be some strange occurrences that are happening, and people are wondering if by some circumstance there has been fairy fruit that has made its way into the human realm. And it's about the mayor of this town trying to solve the mystery about what is happening. So I thought it was really good. I gave this book 3.5 stars. I enjoyed my time with it, but I did have to take it very slowly. I find that these older fantasy books require more of me than modern fantasy, which is the style that we're used to reading. It is the dialogue is the way that we are used to experiencing dialogue and stories. The type of narration is the way that we have been experiencing it for decades. So when you go back and you read something from 100 years ago, of course it feels a little bit different. And at least for me, if I want to enjoy those stories and I want to understand everything that's happening and I want to feel like I'm actually experiencing the book, then I have to take it a little more slowly. So I read through this one nice and slow, and it was a great experience. I'm very glad that I read it. Unlike Neil Gaiman, it does not rank in the best fantasy books ever written for me, but I appreciate it for the obvious influence that it has had on authors whose work I really admire. And it's a great segue because the other adult fantasy book that I read this month was one of my favorites by Neil Gaiman, and that is his most recent novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful book. And reading Lud in the Mist and then rereading The Ocean at the End of the Lane so close together, it is easy to see that Hope Mirrlees' work did have a big impact on Neil Gaiman. It did really influence the way that he writes his stories, obviously the way that he thinks about fantasy, the way that he thinks about fairies and alternate dimensions, and the way that magic can bleed into our world. These were a perfect combination of books to read together. So if you have any interest in older fantasy and you have any interest in exploring Neil Gaiman's work, I thought that these books made an excellent pair to read in the same month. I love The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is most definitely a 5-star book for me. I'm hoping to do a discussion about it with Chaz, who did a review for this book that I will link below. And actually, my friend Baron also did a review for this book, so I will leave his review below. I don't think I'm going to review this book because I am hoping to discuss it with some friends, but if you're looking for some more thoughts or you want to know what it's about, then I will leave those reviews below so that you can check those out. But Neil Gaiman, always such a pleasure to read. I love reading anything by him, and I think that The Ocean at the End of the Lane, if you enjoy magical realism, if you enjoy literary fiction, then I think that is a perfect place to start. A little bit different, so a genre that I do not read often, but that I binged through this month is historical fiction. So I read Bernard Cornwell's The Warlord Chronicles this month. So this is Cornwell's take on Arthurian legend, and it is written very much as historical fiction. It is written as if Arthur was a real person. So if indeed Arthur was real, which is still a disputed historical fact, if he was real, then this is a retelling that could very well describe what his life would have been like, the types of struggles that he would have had. And so many people say that this is the best of all the Arthurian retellings. And although I think for me, Mary Stuart's Arthurian retellings will always be my favorite just because I like that layer of magic. I really love those books. They have a really special place in my heart, but these are a very close second, and I could not argue with anybody who ranks these as their top choices. These books were phenomenal. I read the first one and then listened to the second and third via audiobook because Alan from the Library of Alexandria had just sung the praises of these audiobooks, and I have to agree with him. I think they are fantastic. This was a 5-star series from me. If you have any interest in Arthurian legend, if you have any interest in historical fiction, then do yourself a favor and either read or listen to these books. They are phenomenal. I am going to be doing a series review for these books, so you can look forward to that in the next week or so. And so I won't touch on them too much here, except to say that I loved them. I had to read them back to back. I could not take a break between them. And if you are at all interested in historical fiction, then you must pick them up. With that, so when I was reading these Arthurian stories, I was also watching Vinland Saga, the anime Vinland Saga, which is based off the manga. And with Vinland Saga and the Warlord Chronicles and Parable of the Sower, there were a lot of dark books this month. There were a lot of books that were not, they weren't necessarily sad, but it was just a very brutal and violent atmosphere, which I do enjoy, but it's nice to have some happiness to break that up. And so I did end up reading a couple of romances this month. I know this is definitely not what the people who watch this channel are usually into. So if you want to skip past this, I will have it timestamped. But for those of you who like to intersperse your fantasy reads with romance, I did read 3 romance titles this month. The very first one was the ending of a companion series, and that was Helen Huang's The Heart Principle. This was unfortunately my least favorite book of the month. I gave this one 2 stars, which was really disappointing because I really enjoyed the other books in the series, especially book 2. But for me, this was a very heavy book, and I was going into it looking for lighthearted rom-com, and what I got was a very deep and heavy exploration of family dynamics, of the pressures that your family can put on you, on the pressures that you put on yourself, and it was really well done, but it was not what I was looking for, unfortunately. And the companion character in this book is the male half of the romance, and I really enjoyed his character from previous books, and I felt like his story kind of got left by the wayside in this book. He was a fantastic character. He was someone who I was really looking forward to getting to know and watch his story unfold, and I think that because these were such important topics and such heavy topics that Helen Huang was exploring, his story got left behind. And I can understand why that was. I think that this is a really important topic to touch on. The things that get explored in this book are really, really important, but it was not a lighthearted rom-com. And I did not get the information about the character that I was really invested in over the course of the series. So it just did not hit the right notes for me. But I still do really recommend this series. I really loved book 2 in particular. I don't know if anybody else has been following along with this series, but if you have, then I would love to know your thoughts about it, because I have seen some mixed opinions online, and I think depending on your mindset and how you feel going into the book, that might really impact how it worked out for you. The second romance that I read this month was really cute, and I ended up really enjoying it. This was called The Charm Offensive, and it was about a young man who is obsessed with romance, and he works in what this universe is essentially the equivalent of The Bachelor. So it's this reality TV show where you have all these young women who are vying for the affections of one gentleman. And the man that they hire to be their bachelor equivalent is what they describe as like a disaster of a human. He has been this child genius who kind of came up through the tech industry in the Silicon Valley and somehow ended up losing his own company. And through the loss of his company, he became this kind of media/PR nightmare. And his publicist thinks that a good way to improve his public image is to put him on this show. He has had a lot of difficulty in finding a romantic partner, and they feel like this will help his reputation, it will help his public image, and it will help him find a person to be with, because he has had difficulty finding that. And this young kind of idealistic man who is so passionate about falling in love and his whole soul goes into creating the show kind of meets up with this awkward, grumpy guy who is completely cynical about the whole process, and they spend a lot of time together and feelings emerge. And it is a really sweet book. It was really fun, really fluffy, really lighthearted, and it was exactly what I was looking for out of romance this month, because I wanted something that was going to be fluffy and cute and that was going to be helpful in kind of pulling me away from those more like bleak and violent reads that I was having. That being said, I thought that the writing was very sharp in this book, and it did explore some important topics. So it didn't shy away from real world issues. It talked a lot about mental health, about mental illness, about those difficulties in interpersonal interactions. So I think it still covered a lot of really important things, but it did not sacrifice that kind of bubbly, fluffy romance feel, which is what I was looking for. So that was a 4-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. If you're looking for something light and fluffy to break up the TBR, then I would highly recommend that book. And the very last romance that I read for this month is one that was on my anticipated reads for 2021, and that was Evie Dunmore's A Portrait of a Scotsman. So this is also a continuation in a romance companion series, and this is historical romance. So the whole premise of this series at large is that all of the heroines are members of the suffragist movement. So they're all very involved in politics, they're all very involved in the fight for women's rights, and they all fall in love with usually grumpy men. I think most of them have been pretty crabby over the course of the series, and this was not an exception. In this book, we have one of our young heroines who becomes romantically entangled with a Scotsman who has a very poor reputation. So he is very rich. He kind of deals in some shady underworld dealings. And this young woman comes from a very well-to-do, but also very privileged and proper family, and she finds herself romantically entangled with this man. So it is a marriage of convenience trope, which is a common historical romance trope, and it's about them discovering what the other person in the relationship is actually like. So we have our female protagonist who is very passionate, but also somewhat naive to the ways of the world and how the world actually functions. And then we have our male protagonist who is this standoffish man who has a lot of wealth, but not a lot of social standing. And so it's about them getting to know the more intimate parts of each other. And I liked it. I gave this one 3 stars. I thought it was firmly in the middle. There was a lot of talking about politics in this book. And again, just like with the Heart Principle, that was nice and it was fine. but it's not what I go to romance for. When I read a romance, that is what I go in it for. I go in it for the fluff. I go in it for the tropes. I go in it for the drama. And I like it when there are some more of those serious topics that are interwoven, but I don't want it to overpower the romance in the story. And I felt like this came very close to overpowering the romance in the story. And this opens up, it invites a whole other conversation about where's the delineation between quote unquote women's fiction, which is a title that I don't even like, but that type of book versus romance. Like where's the transition there? What belongs in which category? Should we even categorize them? But just to my personal preference, when I go into a romance, I want it to be silly and light and fluffy, with some angst and some feelings and some important topics explored, but ultimately I want it to make me feel good, because I use it in instances like this where the other books that I've read that month have been very bleak and violent, and I need to have a happily ever after to make me feel a little bit better. But Portrait of a Scotsman was good. I'm looking forward to continuing to read Evie Dunmore's books into the future. And that's all for the romances. The very last thing that I want to talk about for the month of September is the book that I have not finished. And that is The Eye of the World, Book 1 of Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. I apologize. It has never taken me this long to read a book of this length. And there's a lot of reasons that are contributing to that. Like I said, it was a very tough month. I had a lot of work stuff happening. There were some sicknesses. There were some absences from school. There was a lot of stuff in life that was happening. I was watching a lot of heavy TV shows. I was watching Vinland Saga, which was very, very good. Please watch it if you are at all interested in anime, but it was very dark. I was reading a lot of dark stories. And I guess I just found it hard to get into the first Wheel of Time book. So I'm thinking that some of it was me, and I think some of it is just the writing style is difficult for me to become really invested in. I don't want to talk too much about the Wheel of Time because I am going to finish it, and then I am going to do a dedicated video talking about some of the things that I really liked, some of the things that I struggled with, and my plans for the series moving into the future. But I had really hoped to be able to talk about it in this wrap-up, but unfortunately, I did not get to finish it, so I can't really talk about it in the wrap-up other than to say that I am still reading it and I will finish it, and I still plan to read book 2 in October. But those are all of my reads for the month of September. It was a really fun month. Like I said, a lot of different types of books this month. I have a totally jam-packed October TBR, as you probably saw from my most recent video, which I'm really looking forward to. I would love to know what books you read in September, which books you really enjoyed. If you have any questions about any of the books that I have read, please let me know, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye. So, after I finished the goodbye, I remembered that there was a book that I didn't talk about, and I want to talk about it because I loved it so much. So surprise, this is an addendum. This is a PS at the end of the video. I read one work of literary fiction in September, and that was the book Fight Night by Miriam Toews. So Miriam Toews is a Canadian author. She is one of my favorite authors. She writes books about, they usually center around families, especially women in families, and she weaves in the topics of mental health, mental illness, addiction, and the complex interpersonal dynamics when you have families who are afflicted by those particular things. And she is so funny. She tackles topics that are really tough, really sad, that are heart-wrenching, but does it with such wit, such humor that you cannot help but fall in love with her books. When she releases a new book, I read it immediately, and that is what I did with Fight Night. As soon as it came, I pre-ordered it, and as soon as it came in the mail, I had to read it that day. It was very short. I think it was around 250 pages, and I just read it in one sitting. It was a beautiful, beautiful novel. It made me cry. It made me laugh so much. It made me think about so many things. And I know that these topics are things that are personally very close to my heart and my reading taste, because this is what I do. This is what I do every day. This is what I do at work. But I love it when authors can handle these topics with such sensitivity, but with such a sense of realism that make you really understand what it's like for families who are in this position, families who struggle with these things every day. And I just have to say that if you are interested in literary fiction, if you ever use literary fiction to break up some of your fantasy reads, if that's part of what you enjoy, I cannot recommend her work highly enough. Her book, A Complicated Kindness, is my favorite by her, but all of the books that I have read by her are phenomenal, and I did not want to leave off this wrap up without including this book because I enjoyed it so much. It was a 5-star read for me, for sure, and if you are at all interested, then please pick it up. That is the actual end of the video. Those are all of the books that I read in September. Please, again, let me know what you read in September and what you enjoyed, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!